Hey everybody. This lesson is going to go over the lesson in the week 9 module on garbled sentences and modifiers. So there is a handout that hopefully you have looked over, and I'm going to go through that handout and then explain a little bit of what you're going to be asked to do in the modifiers exercise that you have to complete. So looking at the handout on garbled sentences and modifiers, it starts off by explaining what we mean by garbled sentences. And if something is garbled, it means it's all kind of jumbled and messy. So if you have a garbled sentence, it's a sentence that doesn't make sense for a variety of reasons. But it's one of those sentences where you read it, you just stop and you're like, wait, what? It just, something doesn't make sense about it. And there are a lot of different reasons why we can end up with those, but they are certainly something that we need to go back and fix, right? And sometimes it's hard for us to even pick up on them in our own writing because we know what we meant. So sometimes it takes someone else reading over the paper. That's why it's always a good idea to have another set of eyes look over your essays before you submit them. Because these types of errors, maybe the grammar and spell check on Word will catch it, but if not, then someone else's eyes will probably catch it because they don't know what your original thought was. So it will simply make them stop and say, I'm not sure what that was supposed to mean. I don't know what you're trying to say there. The other thing that this handout goes over is when we have sentences that end up being confusing because of how we've used our modifiers, right? So you can have a sentence that's garbled, that's just all jumbled and messed up. And then you can have a sentence that is a little unclear because of where you've positioned your modifiers. And modifiers, if you remember, to modify something is to add on to it. So our modifiers in language are the things that add on to our thoughts, that describe things. So the most basic modifiers are adjectives and adverbs, right? So the green car, the red dress, she walked quickly, he talked slowly, right? So those are basic modifiers, but we also have a whole bunch of other types of modifiers, and you can have phrases that modify something in your sentence. You're just basically adding more information about that subject, about that noun or verb. And that's what makes our writing interesting. It's what gives our readers more information. So having those modifiers and having those phrases is very important. But think of it this way. If you have a sentence that has 3 nouns in it, and you're using a word or a phrase to modify one of those 3 nouns, you have to make sure that your reader knows that that modifier is going with the correct noun, right? So if you have girl, dress, and shoes in the same sentence, and the dress is red, you have to make sure that you position that modifier, the word red, so that it's clear you're talking about the dress being red, not the girl and not the shoes, right? That's pretty easy when we're dealing with those simple modifiers like adjectives and adverbs. But when it comes to the longer phrases that we use to modify our writing, it can get a little messy and we might put them in the wrong spot, and then our reader won't get correct information. The sentence will read clearly, but the reader will walk away with the wrong information. And we're going to get to some examples of that. So that's what the handout is dealing with. The garbled sentences that are just messy and, all over the place and need to be, reworked and cleaned up. And these instances where not positioning our modifiers properly can also lead to some problems. So the first thing that you'll see, number 1 there on the handout, is one of the reasons why we can end up with a garbled sentence. And that's when we have 2 or more possible ways of expressing an idea. And instead of choosing just one way, we kind of make this hybrid version, right? Maybe we got interrupted in the middle of the sentence. Maybe our brain was just working super fast and our fingers couldn't keep up typing. And what you end up with is like this, we took part over here and part from over here and put it together, and now it doesn't really make any sense. So we have an example here where it says, some scientists claim marijuana causes nausea and dizziness, but the user of marijuana comes nowhere near resembling these effects. And we had two ways that we could have expressed the idea we were trying to get across. That there's this claim of what marijuana can cause, but then this contrast that people who use marijuana really don't experience these effects at all. But what we've ended up saying is that a user resembles effects, and a user doesn't resemble effects, a user experiences effects. The effects that a user experiences could resemble something, but we have to pick one way or the other that we want to say it. So we have a couple of corrections here, and the first one is probably the best. Some scientists claim marijuana causes nausea and dizziness, but the user of marijuana comes nowhere near experiencing these effects. Right? The second example is probably probably even better in terms of a garbled sentence. So, we just got lost in this thought. Another question about the Chappaquiddick party is why the men who were married were their wives not there. What? why the men who were married were their wives not there? Maybe this was another case of having two ways of expressing the same idea and it got all jumbled. Or maybe we were just going too fast, right? But we have to figure out what we meant to say with that sentence. So one of the examples for correction is another question about the Chappaquiddick party is why the wives of the married men were not there. You could also say another question about the Chappaquiddick party is why the married men were there without their wives. Either way would work, and either way is much more clearer and easier to understand than the original. So just something to be on the lookout for. The next group of examples gets into our modifiers. This is when we have misplaced modifiers. Like I was saying, if you have those three nouns in your sentence and you're wanting to modify one of them, you have to make sure that you position it properly so your reader knows which noun is being modified and that they don't get confused. It will read like it makes perfect sense, but they'll walk away with the wrong idea. So in this first example, we have Pound wrote to Eliot many times while he was editor of Poetry Magazine. So you'll see in bold there that phrase, while he was editor. So look at that pronoun, he, right? He takes the place of a male's name, right? But the problem is we have two males mentioned in the sentence, Pound and Eliot. So which one was editor of Poetry Magazine? Which he was the editor? If you go by the rules are whatever noun the modifier is closest to is the one it goes with. So if I'm trying to figure this out and I'm following the rules of grammar, I'm going to think that Pound wrote to Eliot many times while Eliot was editor of Poetry Magazine, because the he comes closest to Eliot. But that is actually wrong. Pound was the editor, right? So you have to make sure you fix that, move that modifier around or move the other part of the sentence around so that the modifier is closest to the noun it goes with. So Pound, while he was editor of Poetry Magazine, wrote to Eliot many times. Or while he was editor of Poetry Magazine, Pound wrote to Eliot many times. Either way is fine because in both corrections, that modifying phrase and that pronoun he come closest to Pound and not Eliot anymore. So now our reader gets the correct information, right? In our second example, we have a similar problem. Laura Allende spoke of terror and repression at Loyola. The way this sentence reads, what it tells us is that Laura Allende is speaking somewhere about the terror and repression that are taking place at Loyola. Terror and repression at Loyola. That makes it sound like something horrible is happening at this school, right? But that's not actually what was happening. The terror and repression are happening in Chile. She's speaking about it at Loyola. So we need to make sure that we rework this sentence so the reader gets the correct information. So Laura Allende, while at Loyola, spoke of terror and repression. Or while at Loyola, Laura Allende spoke of terror and repression in Chile. You can even put in Chile just to make it even more crystal clear that the terror and repression are not happening at the school. Either correction is fine though. Number 3, example 3 is a little more difficult to figure out what's wrong with it. This is one of those instances where our brain corrects the mistake, but it's still a mistake. So the computer is used to recall master lists of all a company owns for inventory purposes. So we have a computer, and what it's used for is to come up with a master list. And what's on that list? According to the sentence, what's on that list is all the things a company owns for inventory purposes. Well, what does a company need for inventory purposes? A calculator? Charts? You don't need much to do inventory, to take inventory. But that's not what the author wanted to say. The author is trying to say that the computer creates a master list of everything a company owns. And why does it do that? They use that list of everything the company owns for inventory purposes. So it's not the list that's used for inventory purposes, it's the computer that's used for inventory purposes. So the computer is used for inventory purposes to recall master lists of all a company owns, right? So it's a very subtle mistake, but it is still an error that in different circumstances could give your reader the wrong information. And then the last type of error we're going to look at involves something that we call a dangling modifier. So this one is not just misplaced, it's dangling. So if something is dangling, right, it means it's just hanging out, right? So it might make it seem as though it is out of place, you know, if the problem is that it's just hanging out there by itself, that it needs to be repositioned, but it's not that simple. In this case, what we have is a whole phrase that doesn't have the modified noun to go with it. It's missing something. The entire sentence is missing something. So best way to look at this is just add an example. So example number 1, lacking enough money, the Florida trip was a disaster. The dangling modifier there is that phrase at the very beginning. Lacking enough money, comma. And typically these dangling modifiers will have a gerund in it, and a gerund is the ing words, right? They're based off of verbs, but they can't function as verbs by themselves. You can't just say, I lacking money. You have to say, I was lacking money, or I am lacking money, right? So they will often have those ing words, and they'll often be at the front of the sentence to introduce the main part of the sentence. And we make sense of it in our brains most of the time. Lacking enough money, the Florida trip was a disaster. We can pretty much figure out what the author was trying to say, what they meant. But let's think about this logically. Lacking enough money is the modifier. And we know that the modifier has to come closest to the noun it goes with. So in this case, lacking enough money, the Florida trip was a disaster. Lacking enough money goes with the Florida trip. That's the noun it comes closest to. But can a trip lack money? A trip cannot lack money. A person on a trip can lack money, but the trip itself, it's not a person. It can't have money. It's an idea, right? So you need to fix it. Lacking enough money. I thought the Florida trip was a disaster. Or because I lacked enough money, the Florida trip was a disaster. Either of those corrections are fine. The main idea, though, is that we have added in the noun that goes with that modifying phrase. So that's the difference with the dangling modifiers. Something's missing. It's not just about repositioning the modifier. You have to fix a subject that's not even present in the sentence and add it in. So we have another example here. The house lights were turned down, waiting for the actors to appear on the stage. Well, again, can house lights wait? Right? Who's waiting for the actors to appear on the stage? The audience. But the audience isn't mentioned in that sentence. We have to add it back in. So the house lights were turned down as the audience waited for the actors to appear on the stage. As the audience waited for the actors to appear on the stage, the house lights were turned down. Either way is fine. And you can rework it any other way you see fit. The idea, though, is that you were trying to create this really cool sentence, but you forgot to include the proper noun that goes with the information you're presenting. So you might have to make a few small adjustments when you go to fix dangling modifiers. If you noticed, the house lights were turned down as the audience waited. So we had to change it from waiting to waited. So there's a small couple details that you'll need to fix when you add in the proper noun that goes with that dangling modifier. But it's very, very small changes. So that's what the lesson is all about. Garbled sentences, the kind that are just all jumbled up and messed up and very difficult to figure out what the reader or what the author was trying to say. Misplaced modifiers, where the sentence will read just fine. It will make sense. The problem, though, is that it didn't make the right sense. It didn't make correct sense. And now our reader is walking away thinking something that's not actually true. And then we have the dangling modifiers, where the modifier is just hanging out there all by itself because the noun it goes with, we forgot to put it in the sentence. So we have to go back and add it in. Underneath all of those examples, we have a little practice area, the first of which is some examples of garbled sentences. And these are real life examples. People writing into different government agencies and things like that to get help. And it's a really great example, real life example of why making sure your writing is clear is so important. Because we will have a tendency to laugh at these examples because taken out of context and just slapped on a computer screen, they can be very funny. But when you think about the fact that real people wrote these trying to get help, and that it probably didn't happen for them because their writing was so unclear, or maybe it took a lot longer than it should have because the writing was unclear, that can be a little disheartening. So I hope that people start to realize that having clear, concise writing is very important, even if it's not in school or in the workplace. Life in general, you want to make sure your message gets across. So you can look through some of those examples. I know some that people have a really hard time figuring out, like number one, I am forwarding my marriage certificate and 6 children. I have 7, but 1 died, which was baptized on half sheet paper. A lot of students read that and they're like, I don't even know what the heck this person was trying to say. Well, the first thing is look at the first sentence. I am forwarding my marriage certificate and 6 children. She's not forwarding her children. What do you think she's forwarding? She's probably forwarding the birth certificate for her 6 children, right? She's got a marriage certificate, so it's probably the birth certificates. So we need to clarify that part first. And then the second sentence, which is where it gets really wonky. I have 7, but 1 died, which was baptized on half sheet paper. I have 7 what? Well, she just said she's got 6 children. Now she says, I have 7, but 1 died. So she has 6 living children whose birth certificates she has included along with her marriage certificate. She had 7 children, so there's another child, but she doesn't have a birth certificate for that child because that child died. but she does have a baptism record, which she has included, and it's on a half sheet of paper. So you really have to work through what she was probably trying to say, and then you got to rework that big time, right? There's a couple of other ones that are kind of funny. People always love number 8. I want money as quick as I can get it. Don't we all? I have been in bed with the doctor for 2 weeks, and he doesn't do me any good. If things don't improve, I will have to send for another doctor. So it clearly makes it sound like she's in bed with the doctor, but what she's trying to say is she's been on bed rest per the doctor's orders for 2 weeks, but it's not doing her any good. If things don't improve, she's going to have to, send for another doctor to get basically like a second opinion. In the meantime, she needs money. She's been in bed. She's on bed rest. So that one is kind of funny, but at the same time, it still does not get the right point across. It still needs to be revised so that it is crystal clear what the problem is and what she wants as a solution. There's also some examples of the garbled sentence, or I'm sorry, the misplaced and dangling modifiers. Underneath that, there's 15 of them, and they're mixed together. So some of these sentences are simply misplaced modifiers, where you just have to reposition it to the right spot. Others include a dangling modifier, where it's not just putting it in the right spot. You have to figure out the noun or the subject that's missing and add it into the sentence. So let's look at number 2. The conductor spends a lot of time talking about his grandchildren on our train. So that sentence makes it sound like his grandchildren are on our train, but they're not. Who's on the train? The conductor. The conductor on our train spends a lot of time talking about his grandchildren. What about number 5? Forgetting to buy gas, the car wouldn't start. Did the car forget to buy gas? Probably not. We probably forgot to buy gas, right? So because I forgot to buy gas, the car wouldn't start. Pretty easy. Number 7, the waiter served a dinner roll to the woman that was well buttered. I doubt she was well buttered. I guess she could have been, not out of the question. But I don't think that's what we were trying to say. I think the dinner roll was well buttered. So the waiter served a well buttered dinner roll to the woman. So that one was just misplaced. We just had to put it in the right spot. Let's see. Number 13. While trying to get ready for school, the doorbell rang. So this is a dangling modifier. Who was getting ready for school? Not the doorbell. Someone was getting ready for school, though, and that someone needs to be inserted into the sentence for it to be grammatically correct. If you scroll further down, you'll see that I have sort of like the suggested revisions for both the garbled sentences practice items and the misplaced and dangling modifiers sentences. So you can look through and you can see the suggested revisions for all of them that were there in that practice area. But as far as the exercise, the modifiers exercise that you have to do after this video, it's all going to be about the misplaced and dangling modifiers. We're not going to deal with trying to fix garbled sentences because it's not easy to do when they're not your sentences, they're not your thoughts. But I do want you to just remember that they might show up in your writing, and you need to make sure that either you are on the lookout for them in your proofreading stage, or you have someone else look over your paper and hopefully they will spot any of those garbled sentences that are kind of jumbled and wonky and don't make sense. As far as the exercise, though, we're going to focus on the misplaced and dangling modifiers, and it's going to look a lot like this little practice area on the handout. You're going to have 15 sentences. Some of them will have misplaced modifiers where all you have to do is put it in the right spot. Others will contain dangling modifiers where you have to figure out what subject was missing and then rewrite the sentence so that that subject is included. You'll just retype the sentences the correct way underneath each one. If you have any questions about it, let me know. If you have any questions about this lesson at all, let me know. Otherwise, hopefully you'll keep an eye out for these things in your own writing and you'll do just fine on the exercise.